Side 8. A Summer to Remember by Mary Balogh. Continuing on page 277. I will always be glad that I know, and that it was with you, and that it was so wonderful. But you owe me nothing, certainly not a lifetime of devotion. You are free, kid. So am I. Free. She made freedom sound like the most desirable state of the human condition. You might have agreed with her a month or so ago. He tasted defeat. How could he argue against a plea for freedom? There is nothing I can say to change your mind, then? He asked. No. He lifted her hand, set his forehead against it, drew a slow breath. Thank you, he said, for all you have done for me and my family. Thank you, Lauren. You have been sweetness and patience, and generosity, and unfailing dignity. And thank you, she set her free hand on his arm, for my adventure, kid, for the swimming and riding and tree climbing, for the laughter, and for persuading grandpapa to tell me the truth about my mother. That is a more precious gift than I can put into words. Thank you. He felt her lips against his cheek and fought the urge to pull her into his arms, to use his superior physical strength, to flatly refuse to let her go, ever. Tomorrow morning, then, he said, his eyes tightly closed. We will need to be cheerful, will we not? Regretful for the brief parting, but cheerful because wedding plans are being set in motion. Basically cheerful, yes. I'll kiss you, I believe, on the lips. It will seem appropriate. Yes, she agreed. There will be others gathered to see us on our way, I dare say. There will be others watching. But now, he said, bringing her hand to his lips, we are alone together, for the last time. Goodbye then, my friend. Goodbye, Lauren. Oh, my dear, she said, and for the first time it seemed to him that her voice faltered and emotion crept in. Goodbye. Have a good life. I will always remember you with deep affection. He stood there for several silent moments, his back to the house, his eyes closed, her hand to his lip, memorizing the feel and the soap fragrance of her, and the gentle aura she seemed to cast about him, before escorting her back for what remained of the birthday ball. 22. Summer had lingered on through the hot, lazy days of August and well into September, but it was finally giving place to autumn, it seemed. There was a distinct chill in the air, and clouds were gathering overhead, low and heavy. It was going to rain. She was in the very worst place she could be on such a day, Lauren thought. She was on the beach at Newbury Abbey. Not only on the beach, but perched on the very top of the great rock that appeared for all the world as if a giant must once have hurled it there from the cliffs above to land in the middle of the wide expanse of golden sand. She was sitting with the cloak wrapped warmly about her, her arms clasping her updrawn knees beneath its folds. But she was hapless. Her bonnet lay at the foot of the rock, wedged into a narrow cranny with her gloves, where they would not blow away. The wind, no, it was more like a gale, whipped her hair back from her face and tasted of salt. The sea, on the ebb and halfway out along the sand, was slate-grey and rough and flecked with angry white foam. She was feeling almost happy. She allowed herself the qualifier of almost, because she had accepted the fact that self-deception was also self-destructive. She would not deceive herself any more, or hide behind any mask in an attempt to shield herself from the reality of her life. Hence the beach, which she had never liked until recently, especially on a wild day, and hence her perch on top of the rock, which she had never climbed before today. Climbing it had been forbidden when she was a child, and so of course both Neville and Gwen had scaled it several times. Equally inevitably, she never had. Climbing it more recently had been unladylike. She could remember her shock at seeing Lily sitting up here one day, not long after her arrival at Newbury, and hence, too, her bonnetless state. The wind and the sea air would do dreadful things to both her complexion and her hair. She tipped her face higher into the air and shook out her tangled hair with smiling defiance. Hence also the fact that the likelihood of rain was not sending her scurrying back to the Dar house for shelter. If she got wet, she would also feel cold and uncomfortable, and might ruin her bonnet and her good shoes. She looked up at the clouds and challenged them to rain torrents on her head. She was not with child. She had wept in the privacy of her own room when her courses had begun less than a week after her return from Aldersley. She had grieved for the child who had never been, and the marriage that would never happen. At the same time, she had been overwhelmingly relieved. She had written the next day to Kit, breaking off their engagement, the most difficult task she had ever undertaken in her life. The force of it, of the moment the letter had left her hands, could still make her chest tighten with an almost unbearable pain. She would not allow herself to think of it. At some time in the future, still rather far in the future, she believed, she would be able to look back on the brief summer at Aldersley and remember with pleasure what had surely been the happiest time of her life. But not quite yet. At this precise moment in her life, she was almost happy. She accepted with quiet patience that she was not entirely so. Tomorrow she was going to Bath. Oh, not permanently yet, but the wheels were being set in motion. Gwen and Neville were going to accompany her. An agent had found 4 different houses he considered suitable residences for a single lady of modest fortune. She was going to view them all and make her choice. Against the advice of everyone except Elizabeth, but with the reluctant support of all, she was about to embark upon the rest of her life. Not a passive observer any longer, but an active participant. The mist of spray from the sea, or perhaps it was the beginning of the rain, was dampening her face. Her hair was going to be impossibly curly when she got back home, and her poor maid was called upon to do something with it. Lauren closed her eyes and felt enclosed by wind, exhilarated by the wildness of it, empowered by it. She had read 15 years' worth of letters from the stranger who was her mother. Cheerful, careless, untidily scrawled letters from a woman who was clearly enjoying her life, even though she complained freely about anything and everything, particularly about the man on whom she had heaped rapturous praises in an earlier letter, and consistently over the fact that her beloved Lauren never wrote back to her, never came to live with her. They were letters that would have shocked Lauren to the core even a few months earlier, but she had acquired a new tolerance and acceptance of the myriad ways in which other people coped with the one life allotted them. She felt an aching love for the mother she remembered so dimly that none of the memories was concrete. She had written a long, long letter and sent it on its way to India. She could not expect any reply until sometime next year, but she felt a connection with the woman who had borne her. She should climb down, she supposed, looking with some misgiving at the footholds and handholds that had appeared perfectly manageable when she had examined them from the beach, but she had been looking up then, not down. If she waited until the rain was falling in earnest, the rock might become slippery, and she would be stranded. For a moment, her mind touched upon the memory of Kit helping her descend the tree at Aldersley, his body and arms cradling her protectively from behind, though she had forbidden him to touch her or carry her down. She pushed the memory aside. She was not ready for it yet. It was still too painful. Something caught at the edge of her vision, and she turned her head to look. There was a steep path down from the cliff top to the valley, where the waterfall and pool and cottage were, just out of her range of vision from where she sat. But she could see the bridge that crossed the river as it flowed the last few yards to the beach and the sea. He was just stepping onto the bridge, his long drab riding coat billowing out to one side, his tall hat pulled low over his brow. A mirage, she thought foolishly, whipping her head downward to rest on her knees. Her heart thumped uncomfortably, as if she had been running too fast. It was just Neville, sent by Aunt Clara to discover what kept her so long on the beach. But it was not Neville. The Duke of Portray, then, sent by Elizabeth and Lily on the same errand. No, it was not he. Besides, none of them would have come looking for her. She had told them she wanted to be alone. She lifted her head again and turned it casually, so as not to disappoint herself when she saw empty beach and bridge and paths. He was on the beach, striding toward her. Lauren clasped her knees more tightly. All the guests had left Aldersley within 2 weeks of the birthday party. Sydenham had left a week after that, bound for one of the Duke of Bewcastle's larger estates in Wales. He had been very cheerful about it, doing a good job as someone else's steward with a challenge he needed to take on, Kit had realized. Sid certainly had no need of the extra income. Life at home would have been tranquil and happy, except for one thing. His relationship with his father was better than it had ever been. They could communicate man to man. They could relate as father and son. His father was eager to teach. He was eager to learn. And he brought with him skills acquired during years of commanding men and shouldering life and death responsibilities, and a young man's energy to complement his father's slower, more deliberate wisdom. His mother was cheerful and affectionate. He was once again his grandmother's favorite, though he had little competition, of course. He had come face to face with Reynolds when both were out riding alone one day. They had talked for a few hours, Ralph turning his horse to ride alongside his erstwhile friend, since neither of them had had any particular destination in mind. They had fallen back into the easy camaraderie they had enjoyed throughout their boyhood years. They had met several times since then. Their friendship had resumed. There was only one thing to mar the tranquility, though to call it one made it sound small, insignificant, unimportant. It was the consuming fact of Kit's life. Lauren had written a formal little note from Newbury, breaking their engagement, citing incompatibility and personal fickleness. Right to the end, she had kept her part of the bargain, careful to assume all the blame for the breakup. And the letter was designed for other eyes in addition to his own. There was not a whisper of a mention of pregnancy. He had to assume from the nature of the letter that she was not with child. He had opened it not knowing which of two quite opposite fates he was going to be facing. After reading it, he had stridden down to the lake, torn off all his clothes, even though it had been daytime and total privacy had been by no means guaranteed, and swum the whole length of the lake, using every last ounce of his energy, so that by the time he reached the far side of the island, he had had to half stagger, half drag himself up the sloping bank, to fall in a panting stupor, face down on the grass among the wildflowers. He did not even know for how many hours he had lain there. The foolish part, the really stupid part, was that after he had returned to the house, he had not immediately told anyone. He could not face the questions, the explanations, the emotion, the recriminations, the sympathy, the whatever it was he would have been called upon to face if he had told. He had postponed the telling until the evening, and then until the next morning, and then he had not told at all. One morning, when they were riding home from an inspection of the ripening crops on the home farm, his father admitted to him that he had arranged the marriage with Freya only because he had thought it would please Kit. Left to himself, he had added, he had chosen far more wisely and well than anyone else could have done for him. He had matured into a sensible, dependable man, despite the wild oats he had been sowing in London, even as late as this spring. Miss Edgeworth would be a fine viscountess, and a worthy countess when the day came. The day Sid left, their mother linked an arm through Kit's, after drying her tears, and strolled with him in the parterre gardens. She had had misgivings at the prospect of sharing a home with Freya, she admitted, though she was very fond of her, and of all the Bedwyns, who had suffered only from not having had a mother through their most formative years, to curb their wildness and teach them some restraint. But she simply loved Lauren. She had done almost from the first, though she confessed that she had been predisposed to dislike her intensely. Lauren already felt like the daughter she had never had, but had always longed for. Kit's grandmother spoke of Lauren when she got up in the mornings, and Lauren was not there to accompany her on her walk. When she sat by the fire in the evenings, and Lauren was not there to listen to her, or to entertain her with conversation, or massage her bad hand. And whenever she fancied that Kit was looking restless, which was almost every time she set eyes on him, he had been able to find neither the courage nor the heart to tell them that the engagement was over, that they would never see Lauren again, that he would not either. By the middle of September, with his mother asking almost daily when the wedding date was to be set, and his grandmother urging that it be before Christmas, so that they would have Lauren with them for the holiday, and so that they could start airing out the family christening robes, he knew that he was going to have to do something decisive. He was going to have to tell them. It was during a lapse in the conversation at dinner one evening that he finally steeled himself and drew breath to speak. "I'll be going down to Newbury Abbey," he said abruptly. "Tomorrow, I think. I need to see Lauren." His words surprised him as much as they did his family. More so, in fact. They were all delighted. They had been expecting it, in fact. They thought it was high time. Lauren would be thinking he was having second thoughts. It was only when the unexpected, unplanned words were spoken that he understood why he had not broken the news to his family, why he had been unable to let go of the charade. He had learned something of infinite value during the summer. He and Lauren had both learned it, he believed. He had learned the importance of openness, of talking to the people he loved, even when habit urged him to keep everything locked up inside himself. He had a good relationship with his father and with Sid today because Lauren had coaxed him into talking with them after a 3-year estrangement. Yet he had never spoken the full truth to Lauren herself. He had withheld it for her sake because it was something she did not want to hear, because she might find the knowledge a burden, because it might influence her into sacrificing what was of greatest importance to her, her freedom. But perhaps she had a right to the truth. Freedom surely involved the right to choose. Or perhaps he was simply deluding himself into self-indulgence. But if it was self-indulgence, he thought, as he rode into the village of Upper Newbury 2 days later, on the blustery day, and took a room at the inn on the green, it felt remarkably uncomfortable. The village was picturesque, and there was another part of it, Lower Newbury, at the bottom of a steep hill. He could see, from his room, its small houses clustered about a sheltered harbour, which nevertheless could not disguise the roughness of the sea. He was undecided about whether he should call first at the Dow House or at Newbury Abbey itself, but the Dow House, he found, was just a short distance inside the gates of the park. He went there first. The ladies were at the Abbey, a servant informed him, and so he rode the rest of the way along a lengthy, winding driveway, and presented his card at Newbury Abbey with the request that the Countess of Kilbourne receive him. He was kept waiting for only a couple of minutes before being ushered up to the drawing-room, where several people were awaiting his appearance, all on their feet. Lauren was not among them. She had not been as reticent as he could see immediately. These people all knew. Lady Muir was looking pale, the Dowager Lady Kilbourne grave, Portray poker-faced. But the small blonde-haired, exquisitely pretty young lady who hurried toward him, her hand extended, was smiling. "Lord Ravensburg," she said, "what a pleasure this is." "Mom," he bowed over her hand. Ravensburg. A tall blonde man about Kit's own age came up beside her and bowed without offering his hand. Kilbourne. He was in the presence, Kit realized, of the man who had meant so much to Lauren all her life, whom she had been within a few minutes of marrying, whom she had loved and probably still did, and of the infamous Lily who had blighted all Lauren's hopes and dreams. "What a pleasant surprise," the Countess said. "Do come and have a seat. It is rather chilly outside today, is it not? You know everyone else, I believe." The ladies curtsied. Portray inclined his head. He was holding a small child against one shoulder, Kit noticed for the first time. The Duchess smiled warmly. "You have come, Lord Ravensburg," she said. "I am so glad, as I have predicted it." "And I," the Countess added, taking Kit's arm and leading him toward a chair. "Lauren wrote to you, before telling any of us, even Gwen, that she was going to end her betrothal. We have all been mystified and very sad, because Gwen and my mamma-in-law were both firmly of the opinion that it was a love match, and very much approved of by your family. Lauren insisted that the breakup was all her idea, but none of the blame must be laid at your door. But of course we have been doing just that. We love Lauren very dearly, you see, and it is always easier to blame strangers. But now you have come, and you may defend yourself in person." "Lily," Kilbourne said, "Ravensburg owes us no explanation at all. We do not even know why he has come." "I came," Kit said, "to speak with Lauren. Where is she?" "What is it you wish to say?" Kilbourne asked. "She has ended the betrothal. None of us knows why exactly, but we can safely guess that she has no further wish to see or speak with you." "She is best left alone, Lord Ravensburg," the Dowager added. "She was quite adamant in her insistence that she had not acted out of impulse when she wrote to you. I do not know what happened at Alvesley, but she is quite determined not to have you, despite the social stigma of a broken engagement. If this is a courtesy call, I thank you on behalf of my niece. If it is not, you see a formidable array of her concerned relatives before you, ready to protect her from you." "Poor Lord Ravensburg," the Duchess said with a sympathetic laugh. "You will be thinking you have stepped onto an Arctic continent. We are being unfair to you. Lauren really has insisted that none of the blame for what has happened is yours." "She is down on the beach," Lady Muir said quietly from some distance away. Kit looked at her and inclined his head. He still had not sat down. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "She said she wanted to be alone," Kilbourne said. "She said she did not want to be disturbed." "And so, Lord Ravensburg," the Countess added, smiling, "you will have all the privacy in the world to say to her what you have come to say." "I'll not have her upset," Kilbourne said. The Countess relinquished Kit's arm in order to take her husband's. She smiled up at him. "Lauren is 26 years old, Neville," she said. "She is very sensible, and has just spent weeks convincing us that she is in control of her own life and can make her own decisions. If she does not want to speak to Lord Ravensburg, she will tell him so." When Kilbourne looked down into his wife's eyes, Kit realized two things. Lauren was very much loved here at Newbury Abbey, especially perhaps by the two who had caused her the most pain. And Kilbourne was consumed by guilt for what he had made her suffer. Consequently, he was doing all in his power to see to it that she did not suffer again. "I will walk down to the beach if someone will show me the way," Kit said. "It is going to rain," Kilbourne said, glancing toward the window. "Tell her to come home without delay." The Countess smiled dazzlingly as her husband, though she spoke to Kit. "Tell her to take shelter in the cottage, Lord Ravensburg. It is closer." "Walk down over the lawn," Lady Muir instructed him, "bearing right as you go until you reach the cliff path." Kit bowed to them all and made his exit. It was not really raining when he reached the steep path down the side of the cliff. It was not even quite drizzling, but his face felt damp and his ungloved hands clammy. It was certainly going to be raining soon. He realized where he was when he was halfway down. Lauren had described it once. The short valley with the waterfall and pool at the inner end, and a picturesque cottage beside the pool. It was where she had once seen Kilbourne and his Countess frolicking, and had concluded that she was incapable of that kind of passion herself. There was no sign of Lauren. He turned his gaze to the beach and shaded his eyes as he looked along the wide stretch of golden sand. And then he spotted her, and smiled, and knew beyond all doubt that the summer had not been in vain for her. Wearing a cloak but no bonnet on a blustery damp day, she was in the middle of the beach, facing a wild, tumultuous sea, and perched at the very pinnacle of a great tall rock, which from this angle appeared to have almost sheer sides. At the same time, the scene chilled him. This she had done alone. She had not needed help or support, not from him or anyone else. Seeing her thus, he knew that she had achieved self-knowledge and peace, that she was capable of living her life her way, that she needed no one, that she did not need him. Foolishly he was tempted to turn back before she saw him, but he had something that needed to be said, something he must say. He thought the wind might blow him over when he stepped out of the relative shelter of the path onto the bridge over the shallow river. He lowered his head so that he would not lose his hat. He was on the beach, plodding over the sand, when he finally looked up again. She had seen him. She was watching him approach, sitting quietly at the top of the rock, clasping her knees. It seemed to take forever to walk the rest of the way. He looked up at her and grinned. "Stuck?" he asked. "Do you need rescuing?" "No," she said, with all her characteristic quiet dignity. "Thank you." And she moved from her place to descend the other side of the rock. It was far more scalable than the side by which he had approached, he saw when he walked around it. Even so, she descended at a pace that would have put a tortoise to sleep. He would have climbed up to be close enough to catch her if she slipped, but something told him that it would be entirely the wrong thing to do. Finally, first one foot and then the other was on firm ground, or on shifting sand at least. She turned and looked at him. He opened his mouth to speak and discovered that he had no idea what he would say. She made no move to help him. They stared at each other. And because his mind really was quite terrifyingly blank, he leaned forward and kissed her instead of talking. Her lips softened and pressed back lightly against his. "Lauren," he said. "Kit." After a few moments she rescued him. "Why are you here? Why have you come?" The dampness in the air had turned to drizzle. "To instruct you to hurry back to the house," he said, "if you wish to listen to Kilbourne. To suggest the cottage as a closer destination if you prefer the advice of the Countess." He grinned again. "Kit," she frowned, "I did not want to see you again. I really did not." He swallowed and set a hand against the rock beyond her shoulder. He lowered his head and noticed idly that the sand was destroying the shine on his riding boots, and he had come without his valet. "You are still here," he said, "still at Newbury." He had braced himself for the possibility that she would already be gone. "Only until tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow I'll be going to Bath to choose a house. I am going to live there." "Is that what you really want?" he asked. "You know it is," she said. "Kit, why have you come? Where is Lady Freya?" "Freya?" He looked up at her with a frown. "At Lindsay Hall, I suppose. Why?" But he understood before she could answer. "There is nothing between Freya and me, Lauren. There was once, very briefly, but it was a long time ago. Now there is nothing, nothing whatsoever, and never will be." "Yet you suit," she said. "Do we?" He considered the matter. "Yes, I suppose there is a similarity. That does not mean we would suit. We would not. Did this misconception have anything to do with your breaking off our betrothal?" "Of course not." She sighed and leaned back against the rock. "It was all arranged even before I met Lady Freya, remember? Kit, why are you here?" "There is something I need to tell you," he said, "something I should have told you before you left Aldersley. Something you ought to know, whatever you decide to do with the knowledge. Once I have told you, you have only to say the word, Lauren, and I will walk back along this beach and up to the cliff top and into the village, and I will never trouble you again, never try to see you again. It is a promise. Kid," he set one finger across her lips and looked into her eyes. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want it more than I have ever wanted anything else in my life. For many reasons. But only one of them really matters to me. It is the one I did not tell you of, because it seemed somehow dishonorable, after you had carried out your side of the bargain so sweetly and so well. I love you. That is it, you see, the part I omitted. Just that. I love you. I do not believe it can really hurt you to know. It lays no obligation on you. I just needed to say it. I'll leave now if you wish." She said nothing, just pressed her head back harder against the rock and gazed at him with her lovely violet eyes. The drizzle was turning to light rain. It was running in droplets down her face. But it was not raindrops that were welling in her eyes. "Tell me to go," he whispered. She started to say something and then swallowed. She tried again. "I do not need you, you know," she said. "I know." His heart was down in his boots somewhere. "I do not need anyone," she said. "I can do this alone, this living business. All my life I have shaped myself into being what others expect me to be, so that I will belong somewhere, be accepted somewhere, be loved by someone. When I knew I could not belong to Neville, I felt as if I had been cut adrift in the universe. I anchored myself by retreating into an even more rigid gentility. I don't need to do any of that any longer. And I do have you to thank. But I don't need you any longer, Kit. I am strong enough on my own. Yes. He bowed his head and closed his eyes again. Yes, I know. I am free, you see, she said, to love or to withhold love. Love and dependence need no longer be the same thing to me. I am free to love. That is why I love you, and it is the way I love you. If you have come here, Kit, because you think you owe me something, because you believe I might crumble without your protection, then go away again with my blessing and find happiness with someone else. I love you, he said again. She gazed at him for a long time, her eyes still swimming in tears, and then she smiled, very slowly and very, very radiantly. He wrapped his arms about her waist, lifted her off her feet, and twirled her about in circles, while she braced her hands on his shoulders, flung her head back to expose her face to the rain, and laughed. Kit whooped, and because the echo from the cliffs was so impressive, he threw back his head too and howled like a wolf. 23. How is your grandmamma? Busy setting out the family christening robes. Oh, I am to marry you before Christmas, get you with child by Christmas, and be pacing the floors of Albersley by this time next year, tearing out my hair in clumps and wearing out my boot leather while you deliver our first boy. Strict orders. Why do you think I really came? Just to tell you that I love you? Foolish of me. By the time sanity had returned down on the beach, it was raining in earnest, and they had linked hands and made a dash for the cottage. Lauren had thrown off her cloak and shoes. Her bonnet and gloves, she remembered too late, were still wedged in summer at the foot of the great rock. She was rubbing her hair with a towel and watching Kit, minus his drab riding coat, stooping down on his haunches before the fireplace, building a fire with the wood and kindling beside it. If this were a dream, she thought, she hoped she would not wake up for a long, long while, like the rest of her life. Have you read your mother's letters? Yes, all of them. She is not at all respectable, Kid, and that is a massive understatement. She sounds so delightful that my heart aches. But you may want to think twice about allying yourself with her daughter. Ah, he said, reaching for the tinderbox and setting a light to the fire. That explains a few things. It was her daughter, I believe, who swam naked in the lake at Alversley, almost casting me into a fit of the vapors and drowning me. It was her daughter who came after me on one occasion to spend the night alone with me in the gamekeeper's hut. Perhaps she is too shockingly fast for me. Kit? He got to his feet, brushed his hands together, and turned a laughing face to her. She rubbed harder with the towel. And just look at you now, he said. She looked downward and saw in some embarrassment that her damp dress had molded itself to her body. She laughed. We cannot have you catching a chill, he said, glancing through the open doorway into the small bedchamber within, and coughing and sneezing your way through our wedding. It would just not be romantic. He strode off into the bedchamber and came back with a blanket. Come here by the fire. She came and stood meekly before him while he stripped off her clothes, looking at her frankly and appreciatively as he did so, and before he wrapped the blanket about her. He talked to her all the while. Portray was clutching an infant, he said. They cannot afford a nurse. She chuckled. The baby is absolutely adorable, she said, and is shamelessly spoiled by us all. I have never seen Elizabeth happier or His Grace so relaxed, and Lily can never have enough of her new half-brother. Are you now in charity with the Countess, then? He asked. I have always recognized, but under other circumstances I would have liked her enormously, she said. She is sunny-natured and unaffected and loving. She has always been unfailingly kind and sympathetic to me. Now I can love her. And Gilbourne. He drew her against him, opening back the edges of the blanket as he did so. She could feel his superfine coat, his riding breeches, his leather boots against her naked flesh, and felt a rush of awareness more intense than if he had been unclothed. "I love him too, Kit," she said. "I always have and always will. If we had married on that day, I believe we would have had a good marriage. I believe I would have been content and would have thought myself happy. I would never have realized that my love for him was that of a devoted sister. I would never have wondered why I could feel no passion for him. I would simply have thought that was my nature. But it is not." She had tipped her face up and he was bent over it, his eyes roaming it. "No," she shook her head. "Lord help me," he said. "You don't feel a passion for me, do you, Lauren, and expect me to act on it?" She laughed, and she did something quite outrageous. She rubbed herself against him and gazed at him through half-closed eyes. Desire stabs down along her inner thighs. "Devil take that rain," he said. "It has trapped me in a deserted cottage with a woman who has conceived a passion for me. And no one is going to come riding to my rescue either. I distinctly remember someone up at the house telling someone else that you had asked not to be disturbed down here, and then someone telling me that I would have all the privacy I needed to say what I had to say to you. Now, what do? She loved the way he could hold his speeches solemn, even alarmed, while his eyes danced with laughter. "Absolutely nothing at all," she told him. She lowered her voice as her hands found the top buttonhole of his coat. "Yet." He shivered elaborately, and his eyes danced. "I begin to think," he said, "that I could grow to like women who are free to love." "And I begin to think," she said, still in her low, velvet voice, "that you are about to be driven to the brink of madness by one of them, my lord." "Oh, goody," he murmured agreeably. She opened back his coat and pushed it off his shoulders and down his arms, while he stood relaxed and unmoving. Waistcoats, she discovered then, had far too many buttons, all of them small, each was an accompanying buttonhole that seemed smaller yet. She did not hurry. She occupied herself while her hands worked by feathering kisses over his throat and neck above his cravat. She ran her tongue along the seam of the long scar beneath his jaw, and surprised an epithet from him that was definitely not suitable for the ears of a lady. She kissed his mouth, which he held relaxed. She prodded her tongue beyond his lips, exploring the soft, moist inner flesh with its tip. She stretched her tongue deep into his mouth. "I have won praise and commendation from high places," he said conversationally, when his mouth was free. Her eyes being needed to discover the secrets of the front flap of his breeches. "For military feats that required only half the courage and discipline I am displaying this afternoon. I hope you realize that you are in the presence of extraordinary heroism." Sometime during the last 10 minutes or so, she had lost her blanket, Lauren realized. It did not matter. The fire had burned up and taken the damp chill from the air. In fact, the cottage felt almost uncomfortably warm. "A word of advice," he said, "from a man who has been undressing me for almost 30 years. Tackle the boots first. Would you like me to be a participant yet? Shall I hold them off for you?" "No." She kneeled down on the floor. "An erotically submissive posture," he commented with a sigh, raising one foot. "Entirely deceptive, of course. Yes, you have to tug hard. You are not about to break my ankle, I assure you. I feel inclined to urge you to hurry, so that we can reach the good part. But alas, you are turning all my preconceptions on their head, Lauren. This tortoise-like seduction feels excruciatingly good." "And this is only the beginning," she promised, looking up at him from beneath her lashes before pulling off the second boot and standing up again. "Which," he said, "I strolled into Lady Mannering's ballroom that night, all unsuspecting, poor innocent that I was. You looked like a perfectly harmless lady, respectable, prim." "Prudish," she said. "Precisely." "I should be calling for the hartshorn now then," she said. "You look neither innocent nor harmless, Kit." She had pulled off first his breeches and then his drawers. He looked down at himself, and she touched him at the same moment, cupping him lightly in both hands, amazed at her own brazenness, half crazed with suppressed desire. He looked up, and their eyes met. You can continue this game all afternoon and all evening if you wish, love, he said. Sex games are delicious. I look forward to playing an infinite variety of them with you for the rest of our lives. But unless you have a definite preference for prolonging this, I think we might be better occupied on the bed in there. I would very much like to put that inside you. The greatest surprise of all was the discovery that not being touched could be every bit as arousing as having his hands and mouth all over her. He was still standing motionless, his arms loose at his sides, his eyes heavy-lidded, devoid of laughter, gazing into her own. But his words were her undoing. She was suddenly weak-kneed. "I thought," she said, "you would never ask. A lady never invites a gentleman to bed." His hands did not touch her until she had pulled back the blankets and lain down on her back on the bed and reached up for him. They touched her then only at her hip and beneath her buttocks, as she spread her legs wide. He came down on top of her and mounted her with one deep, hard, satisfying thrust. She drew a few slow breaths. "We can do this the easy way," he said, raising his head and grinning down at her, all the old roguery back in his eyes. "Or I can aim at the highest medal of honor and ride the long, hard route home. Very long and very hard. Which shall it be?" "Which is the road to near madness?" she asked, hooking her legs snugly about his and tilting herself slightly so that she could receive him more deeply. "The less easy road," he said. "The long, hard ride, then, please," she said, using her low voice again and running her palms over the muscles of his shoulders as she watched the laughter fade from his eyes. "Please, my love." It was very long and very hard. It took a great deal of energy. After a while, she became aware of the dampness of their sweat, the heat of their bodies, the heavy, labored sound of their breathing, the silken pounding of their joining, the erotic sound of wetness, the rhythmic squeaking of the bed. For a while, her enjoyment was tempered by the fear that it would end too soon, that she would not reach the startling explosion of pleasure she had experienced on the island bank among the wildflowers, when he had touched her with his hand and then taken her on top of him. But after a while, she knew with an instinct born of love and trust that he did indeed have the fortitude and the sensitivity to wait for her, as he had at the lake. It came slowly, achingly slowly, first with an intense physical yearning in the place where they rode together, and then swirling in slow spirals down into her legs, back into her bowels, up into her stomach, her breasts, her throat, her nose. It came so slowly she feared there could be no ending, no climax, no fulfillment. "Relax now, love," he murmured against her ear. "Let me do the rest for you. Let yourself open and I'll come to you. Trust me." Words dimly remembered. Had he spoken them to her before? She was afraid, mortally afraid. He might as easily have asked her to leap up a high cliff into his waiting arms. But she had known long ago that she would trust him with her life. She had given him her love since then and had accepted his this very day. All that was left to do was to trust him with her heart, to withhold nothing that was herself, to believe with her heart, as she already did with her intellect, that he would never abuse the gift, that he would never hold her love imprisoned. She launched herself forward off the cliff, trusting, never doubting that he would catch her. Oh, love! He was thrusting faster, deeper into her. Oh, God! She was falling, shuddering, out of control, never fearing for a moment, never doubting. He cried out, and his arms and his body caught her at the bottom of her descent, wrapping firmly about her, pinning her safe and warm and sated against the mattress. She could hear her heart beat pounding in her ears, and his too. They beat as one. He was very heavy. She could scarcely breathe. Her legs were stiff from being pressed apart for so long. She was sore inside, and she had never been more comfortable in her life. "We," he said, his voice sounding shockingly normal, "are going to have the first banns read next Sunday. It is high time I made an honest woman of you. Besides, it may be possible to pass off an 8-month child as an early bird, but a 7 or 6-month child would look scandalously suspicious. It might even be whispered that we had anticipated our wedding night. Shocking indeed, she sighed with contentment. Sunday it will be then. A big, tall wedding 1 month from now, he said. Both our families will be set on it, and frankly, I do not have the energy to argue. Do you? I would like a big wedding, she admitted. Good, that is settled then. He kissed her temple. I have just made a delightful discovery, considering the fact that we are going to be sharing a bed for the rest of our lives. You make a wonderfully comfortable mattress. And you make a tolerable blanket, she said, untwining her legs and stretching them luxuriously beside his. She yawned lazily. Stop talking, kid, and let's sleep. Sleep? He lifted his head and grinned down at her. She was filled with instant alarm. Sleep, Lauren? When we are both stale with sweat and sex, and there is a perfectly decent pool out there, complete with waterfall. Kid? He just grinned. I am not, she said. I am absolutely definitely not going to swim out there. It is raining. A definite problem, he conceded, disengaging from her and lifting himself off both her and the bed. You might get wet. Had she not giggled, she might have been saved. Though probably not, she admitted a couple of minutes later, as her naked body plummeted into ice-cold water, and she came up gasping, her hands with a death grip on Kit's. She wished fervently that she knew a few foul curse words, that her teeth were probably clacking too loudly for them to be heard anyway. She shook her head to clear the water from her eyes and laughed at him before doing the most foolish thing she had done all day. She challenged him to a race to the waterfall, and, of course, he accepted. Another bedding in the cottage to be his prize if he won. If he won. She was still getting her arms and legs organized when he was nonchalantly treading water right under the waterfall and grinning despicably. A wedding eve ball had been the tradition at Newbury Abbey for a number of generations. It seemed rather strange to Kit when the bride and groom might be expected to want as much sleep as they could get the night before their wedding night, but perhaps the Newbury bridegrooms, who had allowed the tradition to develop, had not been particularly lusty men. Or perhaps it had been a clever ruse of Newbury brides to take the edge off their lust. However it was, his own wedding eve ball and Lauren's was in full swing. The Abbey was patched to the rafters with Kilbourne and Redfield family and friends. The Dower House, too, and the village inn. Even by the standards of a London season, the gathering in the ballroom on the balcony beyond the French windows and on the landing and winding stairs beyond the ballroom might be called a very creditable squeeze. How everyone was expected to sit inside the village church tomorrow morning, he could not begin to guess. Lauren, with whom a mere bridegroom was expected to dance only once, and he had already been allotted his quota, was flushed and looking radiantly happy. She was also many times lovelier than the next loveliest lady in the room. She literally shimmered in a satin gown of such a deep violet that some might call it purple. The diamond necklace his mother and father had given her as a wedding present sparkled in the light of hundreds of candles. His ring, the diamond was so large and many-faceted that he had distinctly overheard one of his least favourite females, the former Lady Wilma Fawcett, more recently the Countess Sutton, describe it as vulgar. His ring glinted on her finger. "You cannot get close enough for another dance, Ravensburg?" Lord Barrington asked him. "An abomination, is it not?" Kit said cheerfully. "Does the delectable Lady Muir dance?" Barrington asked. "One would hate to risk a faux pas, when she has that limp." "She dances," Kit said. Barrington, as appeared, had escaped the clutches of the ambitious Merklingers during the spring. He was footloose again, his roving eye intact. "I'll go and try my luck with her then," he said, "and see if I can charm her away from that great handsome Viking." "Ralph Bedwyn." Kit grinned, and then turned his attention to a footman who had touched his sleeve. There was a gentleman newly arrived and waiting downstairs. He had requested a word with Lord Ravensburg. Yet another guest. Tit strode off in the direction of the staircase. The new arrival was a very young man. He was tall and over-slender, as if he had not yet quite grown into his body. He was also fresh-faced. If he shaved at all yet, It was clearly not a daily necessity. He was a good-looking boy, though. Kit assessed him in one quick glance, as he had once been accustomed to doing with scores and even hundreds of new recruits. "Good evening," he said. "Ravensbird?" The young man strode toward him, his right hand outstretched. "I read your invitation less than a week ago. By that time the notice of your wedding was in the papers. I came as quickly as I could." He flushed when Kit regarded him blankly. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I am Wickleaf, Viscount Wickleaf." "Wickleaf?" Kit took his hand. "The invitation was to my betrothal celebrations at Aldersley Park. My grandmother's birthday party, actually." He had sent it off at the same time as he had sent one to Baron Bolton, before Lauren had arrived at Aldersley, before he had known of her total estrangement from her father's family. He had been more relieved than disappointed when no one had shown up. "I have been in Scotland ever since coming down from Oxford in the spring," the young man explained, "on a walking tour with my old tutor and a couple of friends." "And where have you been for the rest of Lauren's life?" Kit did not ask the question aloud. He clasped his hands behind him. "I asked my mother who Lauren Edgeworth was after reading your invitation," Viscount Whitley said. "It was obvious she must be a relative. I am an Edgeworth too." "You did not know who she was?" Kit asked. "No, not really," the young man replied. "Maybe she was mentioned when I was a lad. I don't remember. I was sorry I had missed the celebrations at Aldersley, but when I read the notice in the paper, I thought it would rather jolly to come down here to pay my respects to my cousin on the occasion of her wedding." "Jolly?" Kit frowned. The young man flushed again. "You are not pleased to see me," he said. "How long have you held the title?" Kit asked. "Oh, forever." Whitleaf made a dismissive gesture with one hand. "My father died when I was 3. I was the last of 6 children, the only boy. I'll reach my majority in January. I'll be free of all my guardians then. That will be jolly, let me tell you. Are you really not glad I have come? Was my cousin offended when I did not even reply to the invitation? Should I leave?" "Guardian," Kit said quietly. "Since you were 3. "Lord, yes," the young man said, grimacing. 3 of them. A humorless lot. Not one funny bone among the lot of them. And my mother, too, though she does occasionally laugh, to give her her due. And mothers do not have a great deal of say in their minor sons' lives, you know. For some peculiar reason, they are supposed not to have brains. Anyway, for most of my life, I have had leading strings projecting from all parts of my body, like the spokes of an umbrella." "Did you know," Kit asked, "that these guardians have been writing letters in your name, declining the chance to take Lauren in as a child when her mother apparently disappeared during a long journey overseas, for example, even though her father had been a Viscount Wickleaf, presumably your uncle? Replying to her own overture of friendship when she was 18, 8 years ago, with the information that you did not encourage indigent relatives or hangers-on." Viscount Wickleaf flushed and winced. "If ever I used to ask to see my correspondence or their replies," he said, "they would call me a precocious cub, or something equally endearing, and look at me as if I were a particularly nasty insect that had crawled out from beneath the nearest piece of furniture. But that sounds just like them. What you just described, I mean. My mother told me last week that my aunt, Miss Edgeworth's mother, was not highly regarded. She flirted with everything in breeches, according to my mother, and then she went off and married Wyatt before my uncle was cold in his grave. There was even a suspicion, perhaps I ought not to mention this. It's doubtless nonsense, dreamed up by old tappies who had nothing better to do with their time. It was even said, anyway, that her daughter, that is, this Miss Edgeworth, was his. The new husband's, I mean, and not my uncle's." Kit, inclined to fury, decided on amusement instead. "But you still thought it might be jolly to meet her?" he asked. "Oh, I did," the young man smiled. "The family black sheep are invariably more interesting than the white sheep. They tend to be dead bores, or worse." "See here," Kit said, "make yourself comfortable. Lauren is probably dancing with someone. I'll fetch her down as soon as she is free. I can assure you, beyond any reasonable doubt, that my bride is indeed a legitimate member of the Edgeworth family." Oh, I dare say, the Viscount said good-naturedly. But I really wouldn't care a fig if she wasn't, you know. She has your colour eyes, Kit said, smiling. I should have realized who you were as soon as I walked through the door, but the light was behind you then. Ah, the Edgeworth's eyes, the young man said. They always look better on the women than the men. Kit chuckled to himself as he made his way back upstairs, greeting guests as he went, acknowledging their congratulations and good wishes. The stripling was surely going to discover within the next 3 or 4 years that women would fall all over themselves for just a single glance from Viscount Wickleaf's bilious eyes. 24. Lauren's dressing room suddenly seemed rather crowded, even though she had dismissed her tearful maid 5 minutes before. The silly girl had sniffed and wept all through the hour of dressing her mistress and styling her hair. She had never been happier in her life, she had declared, while hiccuping woefully, and though she did not entirely fancy not seeing her mum, who lived in Lower Newbury, so often, she would be thrilled to move to Aldersley and call Lord Ravensburg master. He was the handsomest, kindest gent she had ever clapped eyes upon. Lauren had made allowances for the fact that it was a day when emotions could be expected to run high. It was her wedding day. Aunt Clara was the first to come to her dressing room. Lauren had not breakfasted with all the guests in the dining room. A tray had been brought up to the bedchamber, laden with appetizing foods, all her favourites. She had not been able to swallow one bite. Aunt Clara enfolded her in a light hug, so as not to squash either of their wedding finery. "Lauren," she said. It was all she could say for a while, even though she smiled. Oh yes, it was a day for emotions. Lauren knew that her aunt was delighted for her. She had been dreadfully upset at the broken engagement, convinced as she had been at Aldersley that her niece had found happiness at last. She had actually wept. Neville and Lily had had to console her. When Lauren and Kit had walked into the drawing-room at the Abbey late on that wet afternoon a month ago, they had not needed to say a word. Everyone had known instantly that they were reconciled. It had been almost embarrassing. It must have been blaringly obvious why they had been so long down on the beach. Gwen was next to come. "Oh," she said, stopping in the doorway. "How absolutely beautiful you are, Lauren. No one else I know, except perhaps Elizabeth, can get away with simplicity and make it look like elegance personified. Some of us are dumpy." Moran laughed with true amusement. Gwen was small and curvy, but dumpy was the last word anyone would use to describe her. And then Viscount Wickleaf, Cousin Peter, scratched on the door and peered inside, all eager flushes, when Gwen opened it. "Oh, I say," he said, "you do look splendid, cousin. I'm just off to the church. I thought I would poke my head in and say good morning and good wishes and all that, me being the only relative present on your papa's side. I hope this is not an impertinence. The ball last night was rather jolly, was it not?" Moran hurried across the room and took both his hands in hers. "The ball was very jolly," she said, "in large measure because you came and I met you at last. You have made my happiness complete." "Oh, I say," he exclaimed, looking pleased, "but I must be off." He spotted Gwen beside the door and made her a bow. "May I thank you again, Mom, for your extreme kindness in giving up your room for me last night?" There had not been another available either at the Abbey or at the Dower House or at the inn. Gwen had slept on a truckle bed in Aunt Clara's dressing room. And then, less than 2 minutes after he had left, Neville and Lily appeared. "We simply had to run up and see Lauren on our way to church," Lily said by way of apology. "Oh, Lauren, how absolutely gorgeous you look. I'm so happy for you. So happy." She hugged Lauren, regardless of the danger to their finery, and of the growingly visible bulk of her condition. Lauren hugged her back. "I love you, Lily," she whispered. "Well, I would think so too," Lily said, quite unabashed. "If it were not for me, this would not be your wedding day, would it?" Trust Lily to bring all that out into the open. And then it was Neville's turn. Like Aunt Clara, he said nothing, not even her name, but he wrapped his arms tightly about her and hugged her close. She twined her arms about him and closed her eyes. Neville. her dearly beloved Neville, the dearest, dearest brother a woman ever had. She knew, though they had not spoken of it, just how much today meant to him. It was the day when he would finally see her happiness complete, the day he could finally let go of his terrible guilt. "Be happy," he said, releasing her at last and smiling at her. "Promise me." "I promise," she smiled back. "I love him, you see." "If we do not leave immediately, Neville," Aunt Clara said, "the bride is going to race us to the church." "What a disgrace that would be." They all laughed, and Aunt Clara bent one last lingering look on Lauren as she left with Neville and Lily. Lauren was left alone with Gwen. She turned and looked at her, her smile fading. "Perhaps," she said, "I should have suggested Aldersley for the wedding after all." Gwen understood. How could she not? They had been sisters and dearest friends for all of 23 years. "No," she said, "your dignity and your courage have not failed you for more than 1.5 years, Lauren. They will not fail you now." Lauren's maid tapped on the door then and poked her head around it. She was still looking tearful. Baron Galton awaited Miss Edgeworth and Lady Muir in the hall below, she announced. It was all so very reminiscent. It had been spring the last time, March. It was late October this time. The weather was just as lovely, cool but sunny. The trees surrounding Madar House and lining the short stretch of driveway before the carriage reached the park gates and drove out to the village and the church beyond were decked out in all the glorious colors of autumn. The driveway was carpeted with leaves already fallen. The village green was dotted with villagers. A denser crowd of them clustered about the churchyard gates. The roadway surrounding the green was lined with empty carriages of all kinds. Their coachmen stood idly about, gawking at all the excitement, their colourful liveries distinguishing them from the villagers. Ah, yes, eerily reminiscent. Standing inside the church porch a few minutes later, while Gwen stooped to straighten her hem and arrange her train, Lauren could sense crowds of people filling the church just beyond the line of her vision. The vicar would be waiting at the altar rail. So would Kit and Sydenham. She could visualize all the people outside, waiting for the ringing of the church bells to herald the completion of the marriage ceremony, waiting to catch a glimpse of bride and groom as they came out of church newly married. And she could almost feel a small, shabbily clad woman dashing up the churchyard path and into the porch and brushing past Lauren to hurry on into the church to bring the world crashing to an end. Her grandfather was waiting patiently, smiling benevolently at her. She thought she would surely faint. Worse, she felt horribly bilious. Panic clawed at the edges of her control. Then Gwen looked up at her, and stood up to take her hand and squeeze it tightly in both her own. "Lauren," she said softly, "it is all over now. The past is gone. The future awaits you. This is today, your wedding day, your real wedding day." The great pipe organ began playing. Lauren's grandfather offered his arm, and they stepped inside the church into the long nave. For a few moments she could see everything, as if it were all etching itself onto her memory for all time. Faces turned back to watch her approach, most of them familiar, almost all of them smiling. She even noticed individuals. Joseph, daring to wink at her, Claude and Daphne Willard, Aunt Sadie and Uncle Webster, the Duke of Bewcastle, and Lord Ranald Bedwyn, Elizabeth and the Duke of Portray, Cousin Peter, Kit's grandmother, nodding and beaming, Lily and Neville, Aunt Clara, the Earl and Countess of Redfield. But only for a few moments. Then her eyes focused on the end of the nave, where a man stood watching her come. He was not as tall as either the vicar on one side of him or Sydenham on the other, but he was handsome beyond belief, and dressed with consummate elegance in a black, form-fitting tailed coat, with ivory satin knee breeches and embroidered waistcoat, and sparkling white linen and stockings. Lace frothed at his throat and wrists. Kit. He looked formal and solemn, but no, as she drew closer, Lauren could see but his eyes smiled, not with his customary merriment and roguery, but with something that took her breath away even though she had known beyond any doubt for a whole month that he loved her. He had written daily from Aldersley, sometimes twice daily, once 3 times, to tell her so, often in outrageously florid language that he knew would have her laughing. His eyes drew her to him. They warmed her from head to toe, they devoured her, they made her beautiful and desirable and very much wanted. His eyes adored her. She wondered suddenly if she was smiling, and discovered that she was. She was also as terrified as she had been all through a sleepless night, all through the dressing for her wedding, all through coming to church and standing in the porch. Terrified that even now when Grandpapa was answering the vicar's question and giving her hand into Kit's, something would happen. The wedding service, her wedding, had begun, she realized, but she could not concentrate on it. She thought it altogether possible that she might be going to faint. He had never seen her more beautiful. Her dress of shimmering white satin was unadorned except at the hem and around the bottom of the train, at the edge of the short sleeves, and about the scooped neckline, where it was delicately scalloped and decorated with silver embroidery, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, of tiny pearls. Her bonnet, slippers, and long gloves were all white, the former adorned with the finest lace veil, which fell over her face. The only touches of color were the violet ribbon beneath her bosom, its ends trailing to her hem, and the small posy of violets and dark green leaves she carried in one hand. He had never expected his wedding day to be the happiest of his life. Weddings, with the possible exception of the wedding night, were tedious, rather embarrassing affairs for the man, he had always thought. But today he was prepared to concede that there was something to be said for the old cliché. A great deal, in fact. She looked rather like the old marble Lauren Edgeworth at first. But then, when her eyes focused upon him and she came closer, she smiled. His heart turned over. Another cliché. Perhaps weddings were clichés personified. He had missed her during the past month, and yesterday he had scarcely been able to get near her. Today was the happiest of his life. And then he saw the terror behind her smile and felt the rigidity in her hand. It was not simple nervousness. He knew her well enough by God to know that. And of course, he had wondered about the suitability of the church at Newbury, the scene of her first wedding, for their nuptials. But he had concluded that it would be good for her to have it happen here, to be able to lay the final boasts to rest. Foolish of him, stupid of him, not to have realized what an ordeal this part of today would be for her. He tried to reassure her with his hands, with his eyes. He tried to wrap the security of his love about her. He stopped concentrating on the marriage service. "I require and charge you both," the vicar was saying, when Kit paid attention again, and he could see that Lauren was suddenly listening too. "As ye will answer at the dreadful day of judgment, when the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed, that if either of you know any impediment why ye may not lawfully be joined together in matrimony, ye do now confess it. For be ye well assured that so many as are coupled together otherwise than God's word doth allow are not joined together by God, neither is their matrimony lawful." Her hand stiffened further in his. "No, my love, no one will break the silence. There is no impediment. It will all be over in a moment now, all the irrational fear. Courage, my love. Wilt thou have this woman for thy wedded wife?" It was over. It was over. She relaxed instantly and smiled radiantly at him. There was no impediment. Soon, very soon, they were man and wife, joined together as one until death did them part. He lifted the veil back from her face and folded it over the brim of her bonnet. He smiled into her eyes. His love, his viscountess, his wife. The terror, the foolish terror, was all forgotten. The register signed, the church bells pealing joyfully to the world outside, the organ playing jubilantly, the newly married couple made their way back up the nave, smiling at all their family and friends, who smiled right back at them. but some of the congregation had not waited. Cousins from both families and a few others had slipped out and armed themselves before Kit and Lauren stepped out into the bright sunshine, and the villagers raised a cheer, almost all of them now clustered about the gateway and the open barouche, lavishly decorated with white ribbons and streamers that would convey them to the abbey for the wedding breakfast. The cousins were lined up on either side of the churchyard path, all grinning maliciously, all armed with mounds of autumn leaves. Kit said, while Lauren smiled radiantly about her. Nothing had the power to mar her happiness for the remainder of her wedding day. Shall we cower here and hope to be lost to sight among the crowd in a few minutes' time? Or shall we make a run for it? It would be unsporting, she said, to spoil their fun. Unsporting. He grinned down at her, and so it would, but they will be sorely disappointed if we do not put our heads down and run for it. Shall we disappoint them? Absolutely, she agreed, and she took his arm and walked sedately down the churchyard path with him, smiling and waving and being rained upon by gloriously colored leaves. They waved again to the crowds as Kit handed her into the barouche and then bolted in beside her. Their coachman yelled a good-natured command. The crowds parted to let them through. The carriage lurched into motion, and Kit tossed out handfuls of coins that had been lying ready on the seat. The wedding guests were beginning to spill out of the church. Kit's hand found Lauren's and clasped it warmly. They looked at each other and smiled as the barouche slowly circled the green before moving between the gate posts into the park. Alone together at last, he said, or almost alone. This past month has been interminable. Yes, but it is over. Her eyes sparkled with sudden tears. And this morning is over. He squeezed her hand more tightly. Everything was perfect, he said. My wife. Always and forever my wife, Lauren. Always and forever my love. My love, she repeated softly, and then her smile grew more radiant. Oh, Kit, I am glad you fought in the park that day, and I walked there. I am glad you made that horrid wager with your friends. I am glad. He bent his head and kissed her. From behind them came an increased roar of cheers, and a single piercing whistle. The church bells pealed merrily on. End of A Summer to Remember by Mary Balogh.